let's move on and take a look at task 11.5, national and international tail-in hop-off. Told to configure the cluster so that whenever anyone at any site dials any PSTN number that is local to any of the sites, that TEHO routes the call out to the gateway that's local to that called number with fallback to the local gateway of the calling party if or should the TEHO fail due to oversubscription of PRI voice channels or CAC restrictions. Now, if it's due to CAC restrictions as well, then that would also mean, so in other words, if I'm given this allowance here, then that would mean we didn't have to create a separate CSS for AAR. It is still a good idea to do, maybe not even necessarily in production, because production will almost always have the backup gateway of the local. We would never exclude that. But certainly a good idea for the lab, just because if for some reason they told you that you could not have a backup gateway, well then you would break AAR and it would have to only see that one pattern. But in this case, now that we've read this, we realize that we're allowed to actually have a backup gateway as local. So if there was a problem, in other words, if I tried to route a call, let's say I am corporate headquarter, in fact, let's just bring up the drawing that we had earlier. Say I'm corporate headquarter phone 1 or a phone in Seattle, and I try to make a call to Amsterdam, or actually to the Netherlands in general, and so I want to route this call across to the Netherlands gateway and do international tail-in hop-off. Well, that's all fine and well, except if there's not enough bandwidth to route the call, then that call will fail due to AAR, or actually fail due to CAC, or call admission control, and AAR will be responsible for rerouting that call over the PSTN. The only problem is if the call, because of tail-in hop-off, was given a more specific route of that far-end gateway, then I can't reroute it over the PSTN to the gateway because I'm trying to go out the gateway, and that was the whole problem in the first place, was there wasn't enough bandwidth. But provided that I'm always allowed to have a backup gateway as local, then everything will be just fine. Got done creating all of our backup gateways. So in this task, because we are allowed to have a backup gateway, it would simply fail to local gateway, or whatever the next gateway in that particular route group, because we would point it to that route group. In this case, that does happen to be the local gateway. And we would almost always have our own gateway as the local backup. Okay? So in the case that we're allowed to have backup local gateway or any other gateway that might be routable and not run into the CAC issue, then really don't have to have a separate AAR CSS and separate partitions. Did it earlier as a preventative measure. So we are told, however, that we're not permitted to create any additional translation patterns to fulfill the requirement of this task. So let's see how we might meet international or even national tail-in hop without creating any additional translation. Look at our translation patterns first. If I dial, let's say, from the US, so dial device US PSTN partition, I dial, let's say, 9011, either the hash alternate strip, terminate the interdigit timeout, or just the normal pattern. Either one of these sends me to the same place, which is the calling search space translation pattern to route pattern. we first strip off all the non-E164 digits, and we prefix, in this case, we already have country code, we prefix a plus. So if that's what's happening here, and we can't create any additional translation patterns, and we know that everything's routing to the route pattern, we only have one route pattern, we were not told that at least for this task we couldn't have more route patterns. So what might that do if we did? Well, right now, our one route pattern points to one route list, and that one route list always points to standard local route group. But we could create a few more route lists. We weren't told that we couldn't. We were told for previous tasks that we could not, but it just said for the requirements of this task. So we can create a few more route lists, and we'll call this one route list to corporate headquarter route group. Now remember, that this route group, corporate headquarter, actually contains all the gateways. It's just not pointing primarily to standard local gateway. It's pointing to a very specific gateway, which is the corporate headquarter gateway. But it does contain backups. Okay? I know we need to reset, but we'll do that in a little bit. Okay, now we'll add the branch 1 route group and get rid of the corporate headquarter. Copy and call it branch 2, route list to branch 2 route group. And get rid of the branch 1. Okay, so branch 2 has branch 2. All is easiest. All right, so now we've got branch 1, branch 2, corporate, and standard. Let's take a look at each of them. Branch 1 has only branch 1. Branch 2 has only corporate, only has corporate. And SLRG. Good idea just to go back and verify. Now we'll create a few additional route patterns. What might these route patterns be? Well, I'm going to copy this because it already contains some good information. Well, primarily it contains a \+ and it contains the position I want it to be in. Gateway route list is going to have to change. So let's say for corporate headquarters, all calls that go to \+1206, bang, 206 being the area or geographic code, 1 being the country code or numbering plan code, since so any calls that are going to that more specific number, and because we have the bang, and because calls are being sent to us en bloc, which is all digits at once, we need priority. Oops, and I just done it is. So the route list is going to be pointing explicitly at corporate headquarter route group, which has backups, but at least primarily goes out corporate headquarter if that gateway's up. Okay, so we've got that more specific. We'll create a more specific for the +1 512. Point that to branch 1. And we'll create a more specific for, really anything that goes out 3-1. So the reason we're not going to add the area code or geographic code of 20 for Amsterdam, what if the call's going to Rotterdam or Utrecht or any of the other cities that might be served from the Amsterdam gateway? We would want all those. If you're in the Netherlands, we want the call to route there. So then why were we more specific with corporate headquarters and branch 1? Because they're in the same country, but they have they're in different cities, And so we want to route the call out the best one possible. Now that actually wouldn't take care of all of the rest of calls going to the US, so if they weren't going to that city. While this will take care of all Netherlands calls as well as Amsterdam, we actually would need to create one more, a little bit less specific, more specific than just \plus. It's \+1, so country code, North American numbering plan code, US and Canada, but goes out corporate headquarter. And we can really, probably only choose one here unless we got more specific with. So if you're calling to the US or Canada, it's going to go out corporate headquarter. If you're calling to specifically Seattle, it's definitely going to go out the corporate headquarter. So really we could get rid of that just because we already have this. And if it's going out Austin, it will go out the Austin gateway. If it's going out Netherlands, it will try first to go out. Catch here, we have the wrong route group. Okay, so here we've got the route list for branch 2. So now we've got, this is where we were saying some things come for free, like call forward on register, AAR, those really come for free. I mean, if you take a look at the configuration that used to be necessary, the font and design that had to go into it, they've pretty much come for free. All we had to do was configure it, and called party transformation took care of everything else on the egress gateway. Here, TEHO isn't free. We have to configure a little bit. It wasn't that we didn't have to configure anything on the others, but TEHO comes at a very little cost. All we have to do is configure a few more specific patterns and then make sure backup gateways in our route groups. Or backup route groups in our route list, but that's not the most scalable design any longer now that we have standard local route group and egress. Let's test. Are there any questions as to what I'm doing before I'm going into test? I mean, this is pretty straightforward, so I understand for those of you that are just giving check boxes, that's check marks that you're good and all is well and making sense. That's good. Just want to open it up if anyone does have any questions. All right, so let's make sure that there is good. Good, and that we backhaul. Good. Okay, so let's have Jack make a call to, let's say, 9011 3110 704 7444 and hash. And where does the call go out? It goes out formatted as a national or long distance call with the proper ANI out the branch 2 Amsterdam gateway. Hop off works just fine. So what about if I, at corporate headquarter phone 1, Jack dial 1512 62, so a long distance or national number. That call's going out the branch 2 gateway, or sorry, branch 1 gateway, router 2, going out with calling party as 10 digits. Tail and hop off works just fine. What maybe about let's bring call call local, see if that still works. 512 up. 2. It couldn't be completed as dialed because I took too long to dial earlier. Local, so that still works. Call long distance or national. 6 5015111. Okay, call rings on the right line. Went out the headquarter gateway. Call international. 70373 hash. Okay, it's formatted as a local number and goes out the branch 2 router 3 gateway. All right, let's clean these up. Last, where first Desmond calls in, he's in branch 2 Amsterdam, calls 0, 0, 0, 1, 512 602 hash. Branch 1 call, so it goes out the branch 1 gateway. And if he calls 0, 0, 1, 206, 1, 206, 501, quadruple 5, hash, and it goes out the corporate headquarter gateway. Now, we didn't do anything with AAR, remember? So let's invoke AAR again. Originally created the additional CSS thinking we'd create a partition, but we got lucky and we're allowed a backup gateway, which in a proper network you would, as I mentioned, always, of course, have a local gateway as a backup. You would never just have TEHO out to a remote site. All right, so we've got these at 23 now, both of them. So if Desmond tries to call the exact same number, which was to 6 corporate headquarter, US Seattle number, off the gateways, so it's out. He just hits redial. Call goes out his local gateway. Remember, router 1 failed to router 2, or corporate headquarter failed to branch 1 in terms of the corporate headquarter route group, which was what was chosen because of TEHO. Then AAR tries, not enough bandwidth, tries the backup, not enough bandwidth. There's the local gateway. I don't actually have to have a CSS and partition if right before I got what we would have to do if for some reason the lab gave us some sort of requirement. Gateway as a backup for TEHO. Okay, so we created additional route patterns for TEHO, and we created additional route lists that pointed to specific route groups versus having the standard local route group. So if we did have the restriction that we could not have a backup gateway local to ourselves, TEHO, then this would impose an implicit restriction on AAR. So what we would do is we would simply, when we had created these, we would put them in a new partition for TEHO, make sure that our phones sorry, not phones, but the translation patterns that would be seeing these patterns. Okay. Actually, just about anything in here that doesn't have the word restricted on it. So as long as partition exactly ends with, begins with, that does. Anyway, if I could, I'd filter out the restricted because we don't care about those anyway. Those are blocked anyhow. So of all of these that can be dialed, 0 or 9, or in the case, or any of the backslash pluses, all of these have a calling search space, and the CSS is translation pattern to route pattern. So I would go to that translation pattern and I would add the new partition of TEHO. What? Wait a minute. But then all your AAR patterns, which are dialing these backslash plus translation PSTN patterns, would still route to the TEHO. Ah, that's true, but here's what I would do. I would go back to my CSS for AAR, and I would make sure that it only saw this partition. So that is, it only ever reached directly to the route pattern. It never was able to see any of the partitions that all the translation patterns work for. Now, that could have implications with calling party display. And like I said, this is not something you would do in the real world, so we don't really have to worry about the scalability. The scalability in the real world is my AAR CSS is the exact same CSS as my traditional CSS. Well, provided that it can see international and provided that AAR should work everywhere international as well. So it becomes an even more simplified configuration. In the lab, however, we might have one-offs and exceptions, and if we had to make sure that TEHO didn't have backup route groups and AAR wasn't affected, then we deal with it in the way I just mentioned. And then if you also still had to have calling party look proper when it got to the far end terminating phone, the one that had been blocked by AAR and had to reroute through the PSTN, then if we did, then we'd have to create additional route patterns or additional translation patterns and make sure they're in the proper partitions and make sure the formatted properly. Okay. Another thing we could do is instead of creating an additional, instead of allowing your AAR CSS to see this partition here, we could just go back to our translation patterns and create a duplicate and then make sure that these, put these in certain partitions called maybe partition AAR and make sure that those CSSs could only see the partition for this one global pattern that pointed to standard local route group, and these would still go into additional. So there's a number of ways to make it work. Hopefully the lab isn't that diabolical, and if they are, keep in mind that they're not going to, couldn't possibly give you everything in one lab. So that is to say, you're not going to have this many translation patterns and everything that we've thrown at you, in terms of building your understanding and learning throughout these past 10 and now 11 deep dive sessions and going on 65 hours of recording. You obviously can't get through, even if we weren't talking and just configuring, and it wouldn't take 65 or so hours to the time code to point, it would still probably easily take maybe not necessarily everything we've done so far. We haven't added in some of the other servers yet, but I hope the point is translating. You're not going to have every possible thing in the book thrown at you in terms of requirements. They will be minimum what is able to be accomplished. 8 hours is, obviously what you have, but certainly get done everything in the lab. Okay, So if we did, we'd just create the additional patterns and route patterns or translation patterns.